All right, welcome to the Week 15 Forum. This week we are surveying some of the major intelligence services that comprise the United States intelligence community's principal allies and rivals, as well as looking at the state of intelligence operations in some of the major regions of the world. One of the first important distinctions we need to make between intelligence services of essentially, democratic nations is that distinction, between those intelligence services that are working in authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes employ intelligence agencies typically in a way that's more interesting from an intelligence perspective because they are often the primary instruments of domestic suppression of dissent, and also because authoritarian regimes have closed economies and tend to be aggressively oriented vis-a-vis other democratic nations, particularly the United States. I would also note a third category that is, presently democratic nations with a totalitarian past. Germany and Japan are obviously two prominent examples that I have in mind. If you read Lowenthal carefully, you get a sense that Japan is as reluctant to develop a robust intelligence capacity as it has been in recreating its military capacity. Japan's constitution expressly outlaws war as a means of settling international disputes, and a reverberation of that constitutional pacifism is the Japanese government's reluctance to engage in aggressive political intelligence activities. Their primary intelligence agency is effectively associated with the equivalent of our Justice Department. To the extent that they engage in political intelligence, they primarily focus on counterintelligence and counterespionage. And the reason for that, obviously, is that they're viewing it as a defensive operation. They're not particularly interested in projecting intelligence. And politically, Japan is primarily concerned with North Korea. Economically, Japan is primarily focused on China, which has engaged in a lot of aggressive corporate espionage that some believe has hurt the Japanese economy. Germany, likewise, has been very circumspect in terms of the establishment and scope of its intelligence operations, even as their past domestic terrorism problems compelled them to develop a more robust intelligence capacity. Like Japan, however, Germany's intelligence services operate within a much more circumscribed legal framework than the United States or many of our allies. They also have a no spying on friends principle, and of course we can ask ourselves, how rigidly do they adhere to that principle? Now, obviously, there's a lot of ground to cover. This would end up being a 2-hour long lecture if I spent, 2 or 3 minutes talking about each of the countries listed. So I'm going to focus a little bit. One thing I will note is that something that unites several of the countries considered is that they're former British colonies and share a Westminster parliamentary system of government. Canada has made a clear determination not to centralize their intelligence services, and I would argue that they're kind of similar to Germany in taking a much more constrained counterintelligence posture with regard to intelligence that precludes aggressive espionage and/or covert action on largely legal grounds. New Zealand is actually quite similar, while Australia is considered like the United Kingdom in its view of kind of is more like Britain in terms of what it considers to be the appropriate scope of intelligence operations, and their intelligence services are pretty widely respected in intelligence circles. I want to focus the rest of this on Israel, Russia, and China. Most intelligence professionals think, for example, Israel has the finest intelligence services in the world. Mossad and Shin Bet are the two principal agencies. There's another one that's primarily kind of distilling and writing reports. Mossad is by far better known and the more flamboyant of Israel's intelligence services. Mossad carries out human intelligence, covert action, and counterterrorism programs, while Shin Bet, their primary mission is in internal security and counterintelligence. As Lowenthal notes, Israel is a small, strategically vulnerable nation surrounded by hostile neighbors. Strategically, that has meant that Israel's military and its intelligence services are among the most risk acceptant in the world. Now, when I say that, I mean they are far more willing to take, fairly high level risks that other nations would not be prepared to take, largely again with the justification that national security is a paramount need. Um, it's surprising, but Israel absolutely is one of the premier intelligence services at developing human intelligence. They have penetrated Al Qaeda. They have penetrated any number of they've penetrated Syria. They've penetrated Jordan. They've penetrated all their neighbors. They have you know unprecedented human intelligence capabilities. They have also developed their own SIGINT capabilities, and they have demonstrated a willingness to engage in assassination. Some would say that we could learn a lot from the Israelis about intelligence, but I would caution people that the Israeli people have sacrificed a lot of civil liberties in the name of national security, perhaps more than any democratic polity can sacrifice and remain democratic if they truly are. And I think that there's a question about that, the way they treat their Palestinian Arab population. With regard to Chinese intelligence, much of what we know is somewhat speculative in nature due to the secretive nature of the Chinese state. We know that Chinese intelligence is nominally run by the Ministry of State Security, but it's largely controlled by whoever controls the Chinese Communist Party, which currently is Xi Jinping, and whatever confederation of regional Chinese Communist Party leaders that like what Xi is cooking. He has embarked on several year-long tiger and flies anti-corruption campaigns, which some have interpreted in the outside world as a vehicle for him consolidating control over the CCP by basically cleaning up some of these regional, kind of communist party power centers. Like most authoritarian governments, China's principal orientation is domestic. Chinese intelligence is heavy-handed when it comes to controlling their non-Han populations, particularly the 12 million or so Uyghurs, who are ethnically Turkic Muslim people who live in the far western Chinese province, whose name escapes me. And then also, of course, Tibet, which is another region that has about 6 million non-Tibetan or non-ethnic or non-Han people, the Tibetan peoples, that again they have subjected to a considerable amount of harassment and attempted programming. China's principal security concerns are North Korea, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. With the intelligence services primarily playing a role in North Korea and Taiwan. In my view, China represents the most serious threat to U.S. long-term security interests. They're not currently as aggressive in terms of intelligence operations as, for example, Russia. In contrast to Russia, whose services I'll address in a minute, China's intelligence services are longer aim. Our intelligence aims are longer term. They tend to be more lurkers, and they're lurkers and learners. They want to get access to, for example, industrial technology things. They're very adept at developing human intelligence capacities, and that's largely by playing on those countries that have large domestic Chinese populations. And Australia is one of those, and that is one of the things that Australia has been particularly concerned about in the last couple of years, that the Chinese government is using Chinese immigrants as a vehicle for infiltration and for influencing. And they in fact, I think the Australians believe that one of the major parties has basically been captured by China. The Chinese believe that they're eventually going to become a super duper power like the United States in the next 50 to 100 years, and they are very patient. So they're a different kind of threat, but they're also backed by huge resources, a burgeoning economy. So I think in the long term, they are the more significant threat. Russian intelligence is similar to Israel in the last couple of years, especially. They have demonstrated a degree of risk acceptance that they previously hadn't displayed. The main agency of the Russian intelligence is the GRU, which translates into the main intelligence administration of the staff of the Russian military, which makes it the equivalent of the U.S. DIA. Lowenthal makes a lot of Russian intelligence's forced transition from being an authoritarian country to being a more democratic country. But they have transitioned to actually, back, I think, to being mostly authoritarian under the Putin regime. They appear to me to be completely unconstrained by any sort of legal statutory principles that might have been imposed upon them during the Yeltsin years. Russia has developed a formidable cyber intrusion and cyber espionage capability in the immediate aftermath of the breakaway of the numerous former members of the Soviet Union and, of course, the Warsaw Pact allies. Particularly Ukraine, Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Russia has, developed a sophisticated network of nominally non-GRU hackers who excel at denial of service worms and similar forms of hacking that have interrupted internet access in those countries when Russia has deemed them to be unfriendly to the Russian populations. The rogue hacker defense is one of the primary ways that the Russian government has maintained, this idea of plausible deniability, even as they have aggressively scaled up their intelligence operations aimed both at destabilizing NATO governments and identifying, Russian intelligence, who have defected, Russian intelligence officers who have defected for assassination, like they've done in Britain on a couple of occasions. They also aim to destabilize the former Warsaw Pact countries. They want those countries to be, in a state of turmoil. In my opinion, Russian intelligence is a significant present threat. They are clearly intent on taking indirect avenues of attack against the West to destabilize key governments and break up alliances. From the Russian perspective, intelligence is the most cost-effective way of returning to their seat of former prominence. That Russia's economy is anemic, that its population is aging and sick, and that its political system bears a striking resemblance to the way that a mafia family would run a nation state are indicators that the Russian system will not prove sustainable in the long term. But for now, Russia should have the United States intelligence community's undivided attention. So this is running long, as I suspected it might. This is a long chapter. Hopefully I've given you plenty to think about and talk about. And so let's have a great week of discussion.